Hello, friends of Powerhouse Bakery and all my favorite divas and dudes out there. Thanks so much for joining us today in our nutrition session on the value of carbohydrates. I want to talk with you a little bit today about what makes up carbohydrates, and really we're looking at the difference between a simple and a complex carbohydrate, and really trying to learn what makes a carbohydrate a great choice. We're going to go through simple to complex, but we're also going to talk about where the vitamins and minerals are and really understanding carbohydrates. As a registered dietitian, my job has always been to help teach people about healthy eating, about the macronutrients that are carbohydrates, of course, as well as proteins and fats. Remember, there's really only 3 food groups that all of our foods can fit into, and carbohydrates is a vast group because it has so many foods in there. When we think about it as simple as that, it's so easy to focus on carbohydrates and the beauty of what they have to offer as far as energy, as far as nutrients that they provide, and of course, having the building block of a plant-based diet. So let's get started. The first thing I want you to look at is the carbohydrate concept. And so when we think of carbohydrates, we want to think of building blocks. So just like if you ever played with Legos, we know that they start with simple little blocks and can turn into a big complex scenario, whether it be a big skyrise that you played with your kids or your grandkids, or when we look at the science of nutrition and carbohydrates, we go with a very simple carbohydrate and we can turn into very complex foods. So let's break that down. When we look at a monosaccharide, that's just a fancy term for 3 different types of simple carbohydrates: glucose, fructose, and galactose. So anytime we're looking at a carbohydrate and we're in a science discussion, we think of a pentose, which has 5 sides, and we want to think of what makes it simple. If we just turn it into a circle instead of having that fancy angular shape, if we think of this as being one molecule of sugar, which of course is the building block of a carbohydrate, a simple carbohydrate is going to have very simple sugar molecules all in a line that are easily broken in our bodies and digested, and that's what we use for energy, is this simple sugar. So remember that a glucose molecule is actually made up of very simple bonds, and that's where we're really understanding how a simple sugar is. So sometimes simple sugar just means that it's very easy to break apart into its smaller parts, just like with those Legos. Also, when we think of digestion, a simple sugar is a lot faster or easier to access those sugar molecules. It's kind of like in nature, we think of a blade of grass, super simple, it's got one line of nutrients. Compared to an oak tree. An oak tree is very complex. It would take a critter a lot longer to chomp through an oak tree than a blade of grass. Same idea when we're looking at nutrition. If the oak tree has all the fiber around it, which is its bark, it would also have all of the nutrients that the plant needs in order to grow, to be big and strong. And so the protein, the fiber, and all those micronutrients allow that oak tree to live a long time, to protect itself against the environment, which is its phytonutrients. It also gives it a way to live through the different seasons, whereas a blade of grass is a lot more delicate. So same idea when we're looking at carbohydrates. So when we think of something that's more complex, again, we're looking at that pentose ring, we go to another level of complexity. The disaccharides means that there's 2 of those glucose molecules. And now we're starting to get a little bit more bang for our buck when we're looking at how much nutrients or energy is built up in that molecule. So that's when we see sucrose, which is like table sugar, and that's 2 glucose molecules put together. Maltose is a glucose and a glucose. And then lactose, which we get from dairy, is glucose and galactose. Just, again, fancy chemistry terms for having 2 of those sugar molecules put together. So glucose and fructose, glucose and glucose, and then of course for our dairy products, we're looking at galactose. Again, simple sugar molecules put together to make them more complex. So when we start looking at our drawing, instead of them being super simple, now we start having a few more branching variations, and that makes it a little bit more digestibility. And what's cool is when we start seeing more layers, it does allow for there to be some fiber worked in there. It does allow for there to be some protein molecules that are hooking all of those molecules together, as well as some vitamins and some minerals. So the good news is, as we get more complex, the carbohydrate is harder to digest, but it comes with a little more bang for the buck, which means there's going to be some fiber and some protein and some minerals for that plant to survive. And of course, for us to get nutrition out of it. Then we go to one more layer. Here we're looking at polysaccharides. That just means a lot of them grouped together, kind of now like that oak tree, where there's lots of things going on in that plant that really allow us to have many components and a lot of food stuff that gets to be digested for our nutrition. So if we look at my little diagram here, we know that starches come from plants. The indigestible fibers also come from plants. And even though we think of it being as a non-food, meaning we can't really get nutrition from it, it does form a very important role in our body. It helps to bring fluids into our gut. It helps to increase transit time in our gut, meaning that when we consume a food, it doesn't stick around for a long time in our large intestine, creating potential constipation or increase in bacteria that can irritate the large intestine. So we like it when there's fiber as part of that carbohydrate family so that we can truly have a healthy gut. And then we look at how do animals store some of the carbohydrate. So here's an interesting fact. In the introduction, you might remember that I talked about glycogen, and that's a way for our bodies to store these extra carbohydrate molecules. Animals, just like humans, do that exact process. So here in my diagram, we see glycogen, and that's stored in the muscle and the liver of animals, and it's a way to have quick, ready access to sugar molecules that our body has ingested and that we want to store. So you probably remember that there is two different ways that our body stores energy, right? If we have energy that our body can't use right away, remember it goes to two options. One, we don't like so much, which is fat. The other is glycogen. So whenever our bodies have extra energy, we want our bodies to make glycogen. That's a really cool thing because it means it's not going to fat, and it means that it's a ready source of energy for our muscles. So more on that later. But today, what I really want you to understand is that we have complex and simple carbohydrates. And in the complexity of those carbohydrates, we get a lot more vitamins and minerals and fiber, which is really important. And what's interesting is when we start looking at the continuum of understanding simple, let's look at some foods that help us understand that. Because right now in the media, I think there's some confusion as far as simple carbohydrates. We think of them as all being bad. We think of simple carbohydrates as being the white carbohydrates. We think of them as being fast food. Sometimes we think of it that way. Or we think of processed food that comes in a package, pretty much. So this is only partially true. We know that when the carbohydrate is simple, it's easy to digest. Now, fast food can have some simple carbohydrates in it. We've known that as foods get processed, the food manufacturers are really good at trying to make those foods taste yummy. So we put in high fructose corn syrup. You remember that word, fructose? Part of this whole complexity. Here is our fructose. And so if we add a simple sugar to foods, that makes them easier to maintain, so store, easier to eat, and easier to package, fructose or high fructose corn syrup becomes one of those ingredients. So it doesn't necessarily mean that fructose is bad, but when we add it to foods in a high volume, just to make it a little easier to eat, a little tastier, and maybe easier to process, that's when it gets a bad name in those fast foods and processed foods. So while we want to avoid some simple carbohydrates, some of them are actually really good. Let's look at the white carbohydrates. We think of a potato as being a white carbohydrate. If we have that potato and we fry it, and before we fry it, we take off the skin. Now we've started off with a white potato that is actually a very good complex carbohydrate. It's just the way nature made it. And within the skin, there's fiber, there's some protein, there's actually a good amount of amino acids, which is that building block of protein right here in this potato. The problem is when we strip the potato of its skin and we cook it in a certain way to make it a fast food favorite, which we know I'm talking about French fries and potato chips, that's when just sacrificing all of the nutrition of this potato to make it a fast food has now given all of that potato a bad name. So that's the thing that I really want us to understand. The color of the complex carbohydrate is not really the way to identify whether or not it's healthy or not. Here is a beautiful sweet potato. Yes, it is bright red in color, and it's sweet because of the natural sugar. So when we look at our breakdown here, we know that a potato is a plant, and it's going to have some of these sucrose molecules, so some glucose and fructose, and it's very complicated, just like that tree. So we have many branching structures of those carbohydrates connected to the potato. The good thing is, when we eat it as a potato, we're getting everything in a great balance. We're getting the protein, the fiber, and the phytochemicals that come just the way nature made it. Now, if we were to buy some sweet potato fries from the freezer section, and they've been cut, peeled, maybe sprayed with some oil, and then put into a fancy package, we're looking at some changes, not to mention some cost. We're looking at the changes in how the potato has been processed. And anytime you go from a simple, humble potato to a processed potato, you're losing some of the nutrients, and also you're increasing the price. So don't let anybody tell you that eating healthy is expensive. The trick is finding where the healthy is found. Usually in the freezer section, it's going to be harder to find a potato in its simplest form than in the produce section. Now, that's not to say that the produce section is not going to, the freezer section is not going to provide us with some good options. When we look again at our complex carbohydrate map, we know that we can get some beautiful items from the freezer section that are going to be simply cut and put into a bag. So those are going to be the great choices that we want. Again, when you find a plant that has its skin in place and it hasn't had much cooking, that's going to be a great option. So notice here I've got on my table a couple of other really interesting ones. Here is quinoa, and of course my potatoes, and then we go to beans. So when we look at the quinoa and pinto beans and black beans, they are minimally processed. And this is really what we love. Whether we choose to have beans that are right out of the can or in the dried state, there's not a whole lot that's going on in the processing of this product. Now, when we take it a little farther and we buy a product that has maybe quinoa and beans that are in a little cup that's already ready, maybe partially cooked, and all you have to do is pop it in the microwave, now we've changed some of that nutrient quality because of the processing. We start looking at how the cooking process will absolutely change how that complex carbohydrate is actually giving us some value. So whether we want to choose foods in the raw, or if we want to have them partially cooked, it's definitely going to have an impact not only on the nutrient quality, but also the cost. So when we think of the potato and we go from a simple, right out of the dirt potato, we know that it's going to have lots of nutrients. What about storage of these potatoes? How do we store them so that we can have them minimally cooked and still have all their nutrients. So potatoes store in a cool, dry place. You don't have to put them in the refrigerator, but you also don't want to have them on the counter for too long if they're in sunlight. Notice these little eyes, they will start to grow. And so that doesn't mean it's a bad potato, that just means you've got to cut off those. And again, storing them in a cool, dark place is the way to prevent those little eyes from actually growing into the plant. Because remember, the plant is going to grow from this root vegetable. And so it has all the nutrients that we want to see in that wonderful potato. So let's keep looking at the complex and simple. And then I'm going to take it a little bit farther to now I want to show you how it's going to change how our body absorbs. So if we go to a simple carbohydrate, let's get some food ideas. We know that honey, just the way nature made it, is a simple carbohydrate. Is it processed? No, it's as simple and as raw as you can get. Don't let the label fool you. Any honey that is with one ingredient, honey, you do not have to have it filtered. You do not have to pay extra to have it unfiltered or unprocessed. Honey is exactly how it should be, one ingredient. Now, if you go up the ladder in the simple to complex, going up a little higher, maybe something like fruit juice. Is that complex or is it simple? Well, we know that buying a potato is not the same as buying a glass of orange juice, right? We know there's some process that has to go in to getting that fruit juice. So when we look at our continuum of simple to complex, fruit juice is going to be somewhere up that continuum. And when we think about how quickly our body is able to absorb the juice that we've squeezed out of an orange, it's going to be digested, of course, absorbed a lot faster. If we go up a little higher in that food continuum, going up a little higher, we know what fruit juice is going to be digested quickly. Go up a little higher, what about rice and pasta? A little bit higher, meaning that it has more complexity. The potato, honey, fruit juice, those are all fairly simple. And now we're getting into the pasta. So here's an example of a gluten-free pasta. It's made with corn and rice. And if we look at the ingredient list, it's actually pretty good, really very simple. It's just got the organic corn and rice. It doesn't have any preservatives. It's noting here that it is gluten-free, but for the most part, what we care about is that it only has 2 ingredients: corn flour, rice flour, and some mono and diglycerides, which is a very fine amount of fats that help keep it from sticking together when you cook it. So as we think about these products, this is going to be more processed than squeezing the juice out of an orange or getting a potato right out of the dirt or from the produce section. And then even when we look at quinoa, even though it seems like a very similar product, truly this comes just as it is out of the crop. It's been taken off of its vine and a very slight amount of drying, and you get this product. Whereas this one has 2 different ingredients, the corn as well as the rice, and it had to be processed now into a grain. So when we look at these foods, which one is going to have more protein, what's going to have more fiber and minerals? In general, we want to go with minimally processed. The other piece that we want to look at is how fast does it get into our body. So the digestion process will not only have a role to play with how complex the molecule is, also is going to have to do with the process of how we bring it into our body. So the cooking, but also how we serve it. So raw is certainly going to take a little bit more chewing. So mastication, so the chewing process is always going to be a great way to increase the amount of fiber and the rate at which the sugars are ingested is definitely going to have a nice role. When you have to chew it more, it's going to take longer to digest. So this is one that I really like to talk about. Here's an example. If we were to consume a fruit smoothie is going to have some lactose in there, which is our milk sugar. It's going to have maybe some berries in there, which let's say blackberries, and maybe some strawberries. So in our smoothie, we're going to put some lactose, which of course we can call dairy. And remember, when we look at our diagram, lactose is in fact a disaccharide, so it's a carbohydrate that has multiple pieces to that structure, which means there's a good chance there's going to be protein and some vitamins and minerals. In this case, no fiber in the lactose, but it certainly does have other good stuff that makes it complex because it's that second layer. So as we're going through our smoothie, we know it's going to have some sugars that come from the dairy. We know that it's going to have some fruit, so we're going to maybe add some blackberries and strawberries. Heck, we might even add some almond butter. Because remember, the almond butter is going to give us maybe a little consistency, maybe a little protein, and heck, it'll make it nice and thick. Maybe we'll even add some banana. So one thing that's important when we think of simple to complex carbohydrates, we've talked about how the food is processed, how it's served to us, whether it's a potato that has its skin in place, or if it's been fried and turned into a fast food. So the cooking process has a big role to play, but also how we serve it. So in this case, if we serve our complex carbohydrates that have already been processed in a blender, are we getting to chew or not? So the mastication or the chewing factor is going to have an impact on whether or not our body turns it into sugars quickly or it's taking longer in our gut, which is an important role when we're thinking of a complex sugar or a simple carbohydrate. So if we put our lactose in our smoothie and our berries and maybe even a little bit of fats and the banana, we are getting a very quick load of sugars that go into our bloodstream. And that's something that we want to be careful about. Smoothies are thought of as being a really healthy food, and they can be if we want our meal to not need a lot of time for digestion, if we want it to get into our muscle cells quickly. And remember, we talked about the storage. So if we drink that smoothie quickly and our muscles are not ready to absorb it, and it's going to go right into the bloodstream, and say our muscles are not able to absorb or hold on to or utilize that sugar, some of it might get there, but a lot of extra is going to go into the fat cells. So whenever our food comes in as carbohydrates and it's already been chewed, it's a liquid, so we're going to drink it quickly. It's going to go into the duodenum. It's going to have the salivary amylase and the pancreatic amylase that digest those carbohydrates, and it's going to go into our blood for a little bit of time. Maybe we'll get to use it if our muscles are really active, but more often than not, if we get a big influx of carbohydrates, whether they're simple or complex, we have a high chance of it going into storage. So the idea is a smoothie is a lot of carbohydrates, simple and complex, and they've already been chewed up, if you will, with your mixer. So it's going to be a quick form of energy for your muscles if in fact you need it. So the moral of the story is I want you to be careful with not only the type of carbohydrates you choose, how they've been processed, whether they've been cooked or raw. Also think about how they've been served, because if they're in liquid form, chances are they're going to go into your bloodstream and not get used fast enough, which raises that blood sugar. Once the blood sugar is raised, it's going to be a race. Who gets those carbohydrate molecules first, your muscles or your fat cells? And most of us don't want it to go to fat cells. Most of us want it to go to our muscles. The best way to do that is small meals in good balance. So as we always create your best foods list, I want you to think of getting a balance of really nice quality carbohydrates. Here's some of the beautiful bread that we've created here at Powerhouse Bakery. It's a multi-grain bread that's got lots of fiber and protein and vitamins and minerals because we've used flours that have not been processed very much. And wonderful source in our good old beans and even our pastas. And then when you pick these complex carbohydrates, we can also, just by default, get some protein, get some fiber, and keep the sugar content really low. Remember, the speed in which those carbohydrates go into your muscles and, of course, into your bloodstream depends on how quickly your body can digest those. So keep those factors in mind. And the more you can eat fresh fruits and vegetables and grains that are just cooked a very small amount, you are going to have your simple, delicious meals with complex carbohydrates. So thanks for listening, and I hope to see you guys back soon.